If you joined us for our last Drugwatch Investigates series, Beyond the Scale, the Ozempic Effect, you know we dug into how GLP-1 drugs transform from diabetes treatments into blockbuster weight loss injections, and how their rapid rise brought a wave of side effects, warnings, and lawsuits.
Our new series asks a bigger question. When regulators fall behind, how much do lawsuits themselves end up acting as a kind of shadow regulator for Big Pharma, forcing hidden risks and internal decisions into the open?
I'm Terry Turner, and this is Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drugwatch Investigates. In this episode, the cost of failure measured in injuries, deaths, and lawsuits.
And I'm Whitney Ray Di Bona, attorney and consumer safety advocate with Drugwatch. During this series, I'll help unpack what those tactics mean in practice. As we hear from journalists, doctors, and whistleblower advocates today, we'll connect their stories to the legal tools companies use and how litigation can force answers when the rest of the system fails.
Did you know that people taking drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy are now suing over a rare kind of permanent vision loss called NAION? It's essentially an eye stroke that can leave you partially blind.
And it's not just one or two cases. Those lawsuits have been consolidated into a federal multi-district litigation, or MDL, after courts saw similar claims popping up all over the country.
Right. NAION stands for non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. Patients say drug makers failed to warn that these GLP-1 drugs could cut off blood flow to the optic nerve, causing sudden, irreversible vision loss.
The science here is still evolving. One recent study found that semaglutide users had a significantly higher rate of NAION compared to non-users, and that's part of what plaintiffs' lawyers are pointing to in court.
And a lot of this didn't come out during the original FDA approval. It showed up later in post-marketing data, case reports, and independent studies, once millions of people were already on these drugs.
That's a pattern we see again and again. A drug looks promising in clinical trials, gets approved, is widely prescribed, and only then do we start seeing the full picture of the risks. When that happens, patients and families often turn to litigation, not just for compensation, but to find out what companies knew and when they knew it.
And that's where our story begins. When the system that is supposed to protect patients fails, lawsuits become the backstop. Before we get into those stories, we want to bring in someone who has spent years studying how lawsuits can reveal what regulators and even Congress don't. That's Nora Freeman Engstrom. She's a Stanford law professor who focuses on how litigation can function as a kind of shadow public health regulator.
She points out that litigation can serve a vital role in regulation and patient safety by exposing hidden dangers that can't be uncovered through other means.
Here's Engstrom.
Probably the most important thing tort law does, and I've started to write about this a lot, is not about the money obtained, but it's the information unearthed. The litigation system, the discovery system, really has a way of kind of shaking the pockets, of companies, right? And we get this information the regulators and legislators weren't able to assemble, or in some cases were able to assemble, but they put it in some sort of locked cabinet. We saw this in opioids. The DEA had access to this thing called the ARCOS data.
She cites a secret Drug Enforcement Administration database called ARCOS, which stands for Automation of Reports and Consolidated Orders System, and lawyers discovered it during the opioid litigation.
And the ARCOS data is what I call the Rosetta Stone of the opioid crisis. It maps every pill that's manufactured and ultimately where it's sold. And with the ARCOS data, we were able to see, for example, that thousands of pills were pumped, tens of thousands of pills, millions of pills were pumped into little pharmacies and little towns in a way that was just completely absurd and unreasonable. And so that's something that the DEA had. Like, they had this data, but they were just sitting on it. They weren't doing anything about it. The litigation caused the ARCOS data to come out. It actually took a little while. It was secret, and then ultimately an appellate court made it so that that information came out. The Washington Post wrote a series of stories about the ARCOS data, and now it is a treasure trove of information, and it establishes beyond a shadow of a doubt the complicity of certain actors. that you knew, Tug Valley Pharmacy in West Virginia and, Mungo County, West Virginia, that there's no way that anyone could possibly think that these were for folks who really had legitimate pain. And yet everybody just keeps pumping these pills into poor communities.
What Professor Engstrom is describing there is a secret government database sitting on a shelf that suddenly becomes public because of lawsuits. ARCOS was built by the Drug Enforcement Administration to track every shipment of certain controlled substances, including opioid painkillers, from the factory all the way to local pharmacies.
But for years, that map of where the pills were going was effectively hidden. Drug companies fought to keep it confidential. The government fought to keep it confidential. And even when cities and counties finally got the data in the opioid lawsuits, a court order initially barred them from sharing it with the public.
Once ARCOS was unsealed and analyzed, it showed just how extreme the oversupply really was. Billions of oxycodone and hydrocodone pills shipped in just a few years, and some tiny Appalachian pharmacies receiving millions of doses for small populations.
That's why Engstrom calls it the Rosetta Stone of the opioid crisis. With those numbers in the open, you could suddenly see patterns that no one had fully put together. Which distributors kept shipping huge quantities, which pharmacies kept ordering them, and how much federal enforcers had missed while the data sat unused.
And this is one of the bigger lessons for our series. When drugs go wrong, lawsuits aren't just about checks being cut years later. They can pry open internal emails, safety reports, and databases like ARCOS that regulators already had but didn't act on. And that information can reshape public understanding and future policy in a way no warning label ever could.
If you've followed drug safety stories over the years, it can feel like one unexpected side effect after another. Vioxx, opioids, Alzheimer's drugs, GLP-1s. But for a long time, each one was treated like an isolated failure rather than part of a bigger pattern.
Shannon Brownlee and Jeanne Lenzer are two reporters who've been watching that pattern for decades. They've spent more than 40 years combined digging into medical evidence.
Brownlee and Lenzer published their investigation in The Lever. It detailed how drug makers influence the FDA and how that affects the drugs patients end up taking. Brownlee starts with a very high-profile example, the FDA's controversial approval of the Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm in 2021.
It was approved through a fast-track process to treat mild cognitive impairment or dementia, but its clinical benefit in slowing cognitive decline is still controversial. Here's Brownlee.
We started this investigation 2.5 years ago, but we've known for a long time that the FDA has been failing patients. It's been failing to protect patients not only from, unsafe drugs, but also from ineffective drugs. What was it, 2021? The FDA approved the Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm, and Jeanne is really great at looking at the data, and she looked at the data, and we had looked at the news reports, and we said, this is a dog of a drug. And a lot of people thought it was a bad drug. There was a lot of news about it. It was very controversial. And then, an inspector general, the FDA inspector general, said the FDA had done all sorts of things wrong. And then Congress had a hearing and they came out with a report that said, they'd done all kinds of things wrong. And we thought, well, that's just one of how many drugs have been approved. So then we ended up getting a fellowship that helped us pay to launch the investigation.
Aduhelm was approved over the objections of the FDA's own advisory committee, and later investigations by the Inspector General and Congress found serious problems with how that decision was made. Here's Lenzer.
We began to realize we've combined between us more than 40 years of reporting on health and medicine, and we knew that the scientific bar had been lowered so low that, as one expert put it, you can't lower it any further. It's already in the dirt. So we created this database that looked at all the drugs that had been approved over the last 10 years. And we looked at the 4 metrics that the FDA itself says are central. They're essential to determining whether drugs work. To a lesser degree, are they safe?
So they did something no one else had done. They took a decade of new drug approvals and checked them against the FDA's own supposed gold standard criteria.
Here's Lenzer again.
That was you had to have a control group, you had to have blinding, and you had to have replication, and you had to have a clinical outcome, not just a surrogate endpoint. And that's when we found that 73% of all drugs failed on at least one of those essential criteria. And a stunning number failed to have any of those essential criteria, and they're getting on the market. And these are, especially for cancer drugs, is insane that you're getting drugs that have no comparison group, no control group, no blinding. They know what they're getting. There's no replication. There isn't even a clinical outcome. And yet they're putting these highly dangerous cancer drugs on the market. So that was our database, and that's what we reported.
Just to translate a bit, what Lenzer is saying is that for a drug trial to really show a medicine works, you typically want 4 things. 1, a comparison or control group. 2, patients and doctors who don't know who is getting what. This is called a double-blind trial. 3, more than one trial showing the same result. And 4, outcomes that actually matter to patients, like living longer or feeling better, not just a lab number moving a little. And let's stress something else Lenzer said here.
And that's when we found that 73% of all drugs failed on at least one of those essential criteria.
That number that Brownlee and Lenzer uncovered, 73% of drugs failing on at least one of those basic measures in their database, surprised even them. Here's Brownlee.
And, our database shocked us. I mean, we knew that it was bad, but we had no idea how many drugs were getting through on the basis of inadequate evidence. It was really shocking even to us.
And here's the key point. When a drug gets on the market without solid evidence that it works, it usually costs money, causes side effects, or both. Here's Brownlee again.
This is a concept that is really hard for people to understand. If it doesn't work, all it's going to do is either not hurt you and cost you a lot of money, or hurt you and cost a lot of money. And that's something that we tried to convey in the stories. But your question really is why does it take so long? And the biggest reason is that you don't have enough people in a trial. You'd have to test thousands and thousands and thousands of people to really be able to clearly say exactly what the rate of harm is. But there are some drugs that get tested and the rate of harm is already pretty high, even with a small number of people. And that's when you start saying, okay, wait a minute. This drug better do a lot of good if you're going to put it on the market with this much harm.
As Brownlee points out, early trials often don't include enough people to detect rarer but serious harms. You might need thousands of patients followed for years to really see what a drug does in the real world.
But some drugs already show worrying harm signals, even in small trials. And when those drugs are still approved, or when the benefits haven't been proven, that's when the cost of failure gets measured in injuries, deaths, and lawsuits.
If the trials and the regulators don't catch the problem, the next line of defense is often the people inside the system who see something wrong and decide to speak up. One of those cases involved the painkiller Vioxx, Merck & Company's blockbuster anti-inflammatory that was eventually pulled from the market after being linked to heart attacks and strokes.
And that's where our next guest comes in. Lewis Clark leads the Government Accountability Project. It's a whistleblower protection organization in Washington, D.C. that represents insiders at federal agencies, pharmaceutical companies, among other industries, including one of the most important drug safety whistleblowers in FDA history.
I'm thinking about Vioxx. We represented David Graham, who was the FDA whistleblower.
Clark is talking about Dr. David Graham, an FDA scientist who warned that Vioxx significantly increased the risk of heart attacks and strokes, and later testified that the drug may have contributed to tens of thousands of deaths before it was finally withdrawn.
This is probably the incredible watershed case, but it had to do with the painkiller Vioxx. And there we only discovered after we brought the case, the revelation at the FDA that there were actually studies that showed that there was essentially a strokes and heart attack problem which had not been identified at all. And it was only during the sort of ensuing lawsuits from people who were damaged or injured by taking the drug, and ended up being a $5 billion settlement, or I guess $4.85 billion settlement of that particular case. And they discovered during that process or that legal challenge that they indeed had identified within the company the problems with heart attacks and strokes, and they chose to ignore it.
Vioxx is one of the clearest examples of this episode's title. The system's failure didn't just mean people got hurt. It meant that only after years of prescribing, whistleblowing, and litigation did the full story of Vioxx come out, and that's what finally pulled a multi-billion-dollar drug off the shelves.
But Vioxx isn't just a story about what regulators missed. It's also a story about what was happening inside the company while the drug was making all of that money.
To understand that side, we talked with William Soliman. He's a former Merck sales rep who later worked as a medical science liaison at multiple big drug companies. He founded and now leads the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs.
Soliman says the first red flag wasn't a scientific paper. It was a sales directive encouraging reps to promote the higher Vioxx dose beyond its short-term indication, edging into off-label use.
When I started to hear rumors that the sales leadership was encouraging the pharmaceutical reps to go out and to utilize the higher dose in a way that it wasn't indicated for originally. And they were basically encouraging physicians to use it longer term. And that's where I was, it was kind of the first signs that there was something going on that was nefarious. And as you know, that's really technically an off-label push. And you can't push anything off-label, especially from the commercial side, proactively. When I was at Merck, I was there as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and I was kind of in the jungle, kind of in the thick of it, right? Out talking to doctors, feet to the ground, out there with the sample bag, and going to talking to physicians about Vioxx. And what I noticed was that the physicians were comfortable using the higher dose for a longer duration or using it off label. And so that to me was odd. And I felt like that must have been coming from somewhere on the marketing side. So I would say, to answer your question, the breakdown began really, and I think some of the unethical behavior began probably on the marketing side, where they were really trying to get a bigger slice of the market. They didn't just want the osteoarthritis market. They also wanted the acute pain market, because and I remember this actually from Merck. I remember learning the statistic from Merck. The number one reason people go to the doctor is because of pain. They could give patients something to alleviate acute pain. That could be something that can get patients to want to come back for more.
He's describing a classic pressure point in the Big Pharma playbook. Once a drug is on the market, there's a financial incentive to expand it beyond the narrow group it was tested in.
A good example would be GLP-1s, like Ozempic. This class of drugs was originally approved for treating type 2 diabetes, but now GLP-1s are used for weight loss, and pharmaceutical companies are looking at other conditions they can turn into new markets: cardiovascular disease, renal disease, sleep apnea, and potentially cancer and Alzheimer's treatments.
In the case of Vioxx, it was originally approved to treat arthritis, but Merck sought to chase bigger markets like acute pain. This was about the same time opioids were becoming popular in that lucrative market.
And when those safety signals finally do surface, in Vioxx's case, in the Vigor trial and later analysis linking the drug to higher cardiovascular risk, the financial stakes make it harder for the company to hit the brakes quickly.
Vigor and other clinical trials cemented the link between Vioxx and heart attacks and raised the question of why did it take so long to pull the drug off the market?
Well, I hate to say it, but money, right? This was a big revenue driver for Merck. Remember, at the time, Merck really had three main products, I would say. One of them was Vioxx, and they had a lot of big projections for Vioxx.
About that time, Merck's other top-selling drugs included Zocor for cholesterol, Cozar for hypertension, Fosamax for osteoporosis, and Singulair for asthma. Vioxx was competitive with Pfizer's Celebrex, which treats pain and inflammation.
Again, like I said, it was very competitive what was going on with Celebrex. So from Merck's perspective, they didn't want to pull it from the market because, from the company standpoint, it was what was going to bring the company to the next level. And so losing that product would have meant a tremendous financial loss to the company. I think that was, from looking back now, in hindsight is 2020, I think that was the big driver for why it just took a while.
Soliman is careful to say most people working in pharma want to do the right thing, and that compliance is tighter today than it was back in the late 1990s. But he's also seen how internal culture can make it harder to speak honestly about the risks.
I worked at a company, big pharma company, top 5 pharma company today, where I remember very, very vividly being there as a medical science liaison. I was there, not in sales. We were in the medical side. But back then, the medical science liaisons, which were supposed to be objective, were reporting into marketing, which of course is not objective. They're driven by commercial metrics. And I remember very well, we had a whole debate on this particular drug at one of the side effects. And the manager of the team, when we had a bio break, came up to me and told me, because I was one of the first people hired, he said, "Hey, can you kind of quiet down those other medical liaisons? They just keep criticizing our data," even though the criticism was warranted, by the way. Now, those medical liaisons had come over from academia. They were pharmacists. They were purists, right? They were total researchers. And they didn't understand that by criticizing the drug within the group internally, it was kind of demotivating everybody, right? It's a demotivating, discouraging thing. They know that your drug might have these side effect issues. So that's an example of the problem, right? Because you can't really assess the data objectively. You're getting pressure to downplay it internally.
So on one end, you have shaky trials and standards. On another, you have insiders and regulators raising alarms. And woven through all of it are commercial pressures that reward selling more faster, even when the safety questions aren't fully answered.
So, Whitney, you're an attorney. You've got experience in the kinds of cases we've been talking about today. What's your take on what the experts had to say to us?
Yeah, so something that I love to point out is I think that a lot of people really view lawyers and people who file lawsuits in a negative light. But imagine how much corruption would go unchecked if individuals weren't willing to come forward and challenge these big corporations, and if there weren't lawyers willing to take on those cases. Whether we like it or not, civil lawsuits force companies to turn over documents and data that patients and even regulators may have never seen. And corporations, they will go to great lengths to hide this information, even when they're required by law to turn it over. Usually, lawsuits are the only way to actually find out what companies knew about safety problems, how they talked about those risks in their marketing, and when and why they decided not to warn people. And so a lot of times you hear people say the wheels of justice turn slowly, and that's definitely true. Lawsuits, especially, the kind that we're talking about against big corporations or drug companies, they can take years to finish. But going to court usually brings change way faster than waiting for the FDA or other agencies to act. And so for many people, lawsuits are really the only way to get answers and compensation for their injuries. Obviously, lawsuits can't undo the harm that's already happened, but usually they're the only way to reveal the whole truth and to make it harder for companies to make the same mistakes again.
And that's where we're headed in this series, how those lawsuits work, what they reveal, and where they fall short.
Next time, we'll go deeper inside the machine, looking at pharma's playbook for clinical trials, marketing, and lobbying, and how those strategies show up in the cases we've been talking about.
You've been listening to Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drugwatch. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can read more about our discussions in the link in our podcast description. And for more information on dangerous drugs, medical devices, and ongoing lawsuits, visit drugwatch.com.